Ahoy! There's an item that's been the main topic of conversation lately, mostly due to a video from TheOtherFrost, which is Animosity. Frost came up with an unusual build that starts the hunter with tier 2 boots, and the goal is to eventually build Animosity to get higher damage that way. He named the whole thing Hachimosity because he specifically built on Hachiman, since Hachiman has a passive that provides him with MP5. Now, the idea of skipping starters and building Animosity later isn't really new. We saw that at the very beginning of the season on PTS, some hunter players were trying that, and then obviously we had some people trying it in solo as well. So it's not something completely unheard of, but it enjoys a lot of popularity at the moment, especially in this specific unusual build. The full build in this order is Ninja Tabai, Soul Eater, Toxic Blade, Executioner, Animosity, and Kin Size. Now, Frost wants to know if this build is truly effective. He said in his video, I need more information, and for that this has to be made public. And that's what we're gonna dig into today and see how this build compares in various ways to other hunter builds. We're going to look at damage against squishies, against tanks, against structures, as well as a little bit of the power curve as well. We begin with the late game stats and then work our way backwards to the early game stats to talk about power spikes. We're going to use a new method of comparison here, which is with the tool DPS by AntD97. I will link that down below as well. I think it's really cool. What this program does is reading the combat log of SMITE in real time while measuring the time that has passed, meaning it can calculate DPS 100% accurately, factoring everything that you can think of, because it just takes the in-game data. The only limitations here are set by jungle practice itself. As a first step, let's put Frost's standard build here in the running against a squishy with 2000 health and just the level 20 base protections. Without going into the specifics so much here, I looked at the DPS value that was reached at 2000 damage dealt and then averaged them out a little bit with the surrounding values, and the result here for this build is 710 damage per second against a squishy target. But it's also important how much damage you deal against a tank. I took a tanky target here with 276 physical protection and 248 magical protection, as well as assumed 3000 health here, so check the stats at 3000 damage. There's one important disclaimer here, and that is that kin size is not properly factored in because you can't actually change the health of jungle practice targets. So kin size is dealing a little less damage than it should be, but since kin size is in every single build here, and every single build we look at will have Executioner and probably also 10% pen, this will not make a major difference. In this case, we end up with 320 damage per second. So these are our base values. Other builds essentially have to beat this in a way in order to be better. In order to keep things fair, I also threw in a version with Devourer's Gauntlet, which is otherwise pretty much the same, but it does spike a little bit stronger in late game, but has a little bit of a worse spike in early game. This has 750 DPS against a squishy and 325 against a tanky target. And now let's look at some competing options. I wanted to keep it as comparable as possible, so all builds will include Ninja Tabai, Executioner, Kin Size, and also Devourer's Gauntlet. This is because you will go for a similar playstyle with these, you will deal similar damage to tanks and so on, and you will also have a similar level of sustain. That is important because the Animosity build provides a decent amount of survivability. And then what I changed out was the last two items. The first attempt here was something that doesn't include any starter upgrades at all, being Ekival and Berserker's Shield. So you can see from the stats here, we deal 740 DPS against squishies, so pretty much the same as the other Devos variation, and then 381 against tanks, which is a fair bit more. But while we get to the cost comparison a little bit later, we have to keep in mind here that this build is way more expensive. I think especially Berserker's Shield is usually not affordable anymore, and that is the big problem with this one. So it coming out on top isn't really that meaningful because it does also cost a lot more. But we have some other options, and that is using other starter upgrades. The next three builds include either Silver Branch or Ekival, I just toyed around with that for fun, and then one of the typical Hunter starter upgrades. Diamond Arrow, Death Temper, and Hunter's Cowl. What you can see here when looking at the stat is that, unsurprisingly, Diamond Arrow comes out on the bottom when it comes to squishies, because it is simply a less damage heavy item in itself if the steroid isn't active. But Death Temper with Silver Branch comes in at 745 DPS, and Hunter's Cowl and Ekival even comes in at 760. So these easily beat the Soul Eater variation of the Animosity build, and definitely compete with the Devourer's version. More importantly though, all of these item builds, including the Diamond Arrow one, work better against tanks. They deal 354 to 392 DPS against tanks, which is a very significant difference. And even more importantly, all of them are unstacked. If Diamond Arrow gets any stacks, you get a massive DPS boost through the attack speed. Death Temper gets a good damage boost to the basic attack increase, though it's not as strong as in a crit build. And Hunter's Cowl doesn't have its attack speed passive here, which would provide it with further attack speed and even higher DPS. In those scenarios, they would beat out the Animosity build significantly more. But maybe this comparison isn't fair. While Hunter's Cowl provides sustain, the other options don't, and Animosity comes with 400 health. So maybe we need to look at a survivability option instead. As the last option here, I tried Death Embrace. If you look at Death Embrace and Ekival, you can see we come in at 710 DPS, the same as the Animosity build, but against tanks we still deal roughly 30 extra DPS. With Death Embrace and Silver Branch we have less DPS, we're at 688 against squishies, and then 340 against tanks. So it's just slightly lower, but Silver Branch can be nice if you have an attack speed steroid, so in those situations the damage can ramp up. And last but not least, I also want to include Odysseus Bow here, which will likely have the highest DPS, but I couldn't test it in a fair way because the Odin bots are too close together, so you always get all the free bounces, and that's not really a realistic representation. So what do we know so far? In late game, DPS focused builds with a starter, and you can obviously build the starter at the start of the game, will heavily outweigh the Animosity build in terms of DPS, which is interesting because Animosity is also a DPS item. When it comes to sustain focus options, Death Embrace kind of goes toe-to-toe with Animosity in terms of damage output, is better in some scenarios and a little bit worse in others, but it's worth keeping in mind that Death Embrace has a very potent passive when it comes to survivability. I would argue that the survivability provided by Death Embrace is worth significantly more than the 200 health that Animosity has over Death Embrace. Consider what would happen in a 1v1 scenario. You deal 4% of your health as extra damage to them, that is reduced by mitigation, but then they heal for 3% of their health, which is reduced by anti-heal. So this will maybe roughly even out, but then the Death Embrace build provides you with 65 extra physical power from Death Embrace, which every basic attack applied to the enemy is amplified with, and every ability is amplified with as well. And what would you rather have in a Hunter duel to the death? 65 extra power that is applied to everything you do, or 200 health? I think that's not a hard choice. But maybe we're looking at this from the wrong angle. Maybe the damage output is not the most important thing here. Let's look at the cost. Maybe it is just a so much cheaper build that makes it more effective. If we compare it to the other builds here, then we have a price tag of 12,850 gold on the Soul Eater version of the Animosity build, or 13,050 on the Devil's version. And most of the other Hunter builds here come around 13,100 to 200, with some outliers with Ekival going up to 13,400, 450. But generally speaking, assuming the enemy is building Soul Eater, we're talking about a price difference of no more than 350 gold on most of the builds here. And I'll be honest, I think by the time you hit 13,000 golds, 350 gold is typically not a big deal, and if you were able to get some leverage in lane, then you should easily have that gold difference. So the pricing isn't really the big deal here. But then what about the structure push? That is something where Animosity should shine, since it actually applies to structures while Kin Scythe doesn't. The first two variations are again our Soul Eater and Devil's version with Animosity, coming in at 350 and 355 tower DPS respectively to take down an entire tower. They can unsurprisingly do that with a single wave of minions. I'm not going to go over the DPS focused options here, I don't think that's important because again I think the competition here is really Death Embrace. And if we're looking at Death Embrace, then we have 314 DPS with Ekival, 334 with Silver Branch, or 294 with Odysseus Bow. This is where Odysseus Bow really takes a cut, but obviously it's not really a structure pushing item, it is definitely a teamfight item, so that makes sense. Right now, while Death Embrace still allows you to heal from towers, I would say that is definitely the better tool for structure push. Next patch, when that's no longer the case, that crown will go to Animosity. That said, in either scenario, you clear the tower in a single wave. So I don't think it is that big of a deal unless you're specifically trying to fight the enemies under tower and also burn the tower as quickly as possible. This scenario can happen, but I don't know if I would want to focus my build around that. That's up to you. It really depends on how hard you're looking to go to split push. Part of the reason why the split push isn't overwhelmingly better is because you're not building that much power in the build, and if you don't have that much power, then your basic attacks themselves deal less, and that has a pretty significant impact when it comes to tower pushing. But we can't just look at late game when it comes to power spikes, because Frost's build specifically is a very cheap build with the goal to hit some early power spikes. So what if we put it in a race against Death Toll, which again would be built into Death Embrace? So at level 8, Frost had finished his Ninja Tabi and Soul Eater in the game. An enemy running Death Toll would at this point have Death Toll, Ninja Tabi, and the tier 2 of Devourer's Gauntlet. There's a price difference of 50 gold in favor of Frost build here, but Frost build also uses a lot more pots and needs that for early sustain, so they would at least be even in price, if not going slightly in favor of the Death Toll build because you don't need as many pots there, but they should be finished roughly around the same time. Interestingly enough, despite having 2 finished items, the Devos and Death Toll build actually has more power. That's because Cursed Gauntlet provides 20 physical power, and Death Toll provides 10 physical power, while Soul Eater before it stacks only provides 20 physical power. So we're gonna give Frost build a little bit of an unfair advantage here and actually test it with full stacks of Soul Eater as well, at which point the item provides 35 physical power. I just want to see how the best case scenario is if you get the stacks really quickly, whatever, and haven't backed yet. Again, we're gonna test some things with SDPS here. First thing I want to test, if I play Hachiman and I engage on the enemy with my 3, I hit both hits, fire basics all the time, drop my 2 and keep firing basics until I hit 1000 damage. How much DPS do I have? With unstacked Soul Eater, that is 149. With stacked Soul Eater, that is 176. And with Death Toll and Tier 2 Devils, that is 168. So as you can see, they are pretty close to each other. And if we're looking at just the basic attack DPS, then you have 102 with Soul Eater unstacked, 120 with a stacked Soul Eater, and 110 with the Death Toll variant. What does that mean? Even though you hit the spike of finishing 2 items quicker, in terms of power spike, you're not spiking over the Death Toll build. You have to gradually build your stacks to become a little bit more effective. And even then, that doesn't mean that you would win a trade, because Death Toll provides an immense amount of sustain in early game. It drops off later into the game, but at this point I would value the extra sustain from Death Toll over the little bit of lifesteal that you can get from Soul Eater when it comes to boxing. You can lane sustain a little bit better at some points because you can drop abilities on the wave to heal up. But overall, at that point, you have already sustained so much more with Death Toll, especially for the first 8 levels, where you just basically have a constant advantage and your only downside is that you're a little bit slower. After that point, you will definitely have some back and forth with the power spikes, especially with Toxic Blade being finished and all that. And it also depends a lot on the build order that you choose for the other build. If you're building something like Ikaival earlier, then obviously you have a massive boxing advantage, whereas if you build Executioner relatively early, that won't do as much for your boxing. So it goes a little bit back and forth. But overall, I would say for most of the early game and then again in late game, the preferable situation, in my opinion, is having Death Toll into Death Embrace. So what do we learn from this? The Animosity build is a very complex thing. You're building to survive more, but you typically have less sustain than most other hunter options as a trade-off for a bigger health pool, which is not necessarily what most hunters are after. You're also increasing your DPS, but while Frost said that Animosity is technically just a better kin scythe, I wouldn't necessarily say that. Because while it comes with a very strong passive, it doesn't provide any damage-focused stats. A big deal of kin scythe is not just the fact that it has an extra passive with damage, but also that it has attack speed and power, which also amplifies your abilities. These aren't really things you can neglect, and that makes it very hard to fit Animosity into a build effectively and actually makes it win over other options. Scenarios where Animosity is more effective exist, but it's very hard to find those at the beginning of a game when you're making the choice to go into this build. For example, it could be effective to utilize this if the enemy team is going very heavily into physical defense and not very much into magical defense. But normally, unless you're running a full physical comp or something, this is not something that you would know at the start of the game. You can of course also make the choice to go into another starter upgrade later, but typically the other starters are beneficial to build from the start of the game to get the maximum benefit out of them. So if you build boots first and then go into them later, it may actually just worsen your overall game experience up until that point where you finish things. So in what scenarios does the Animosity build win? It comes with an early Toxic Blade and utilizes this better than most other builds. So if you're looking for heavy anti-heal against a very healing focused comp, that could be a potential benefit. It also comes with good structure push, though I wouldn't say it's overwhelmingly strong. It has some nice short early power spikes at certain points, and it provides you with very early mobility for rotations. It also comes with ability healing and a little bit of cooldown reduction. I don't value that too much on most hunters, but if that's something you're looking for in a hunter, maybe for some more escapes or for some big heals with Medusa or something, maybe this is for you. It also provides you with more mobility in later stages due to Toxic Blade, though that is something that you can add into the other builds later as well in trade for Silver Branch, Archival or something like that, so it's not really something that's inaccessible, you just get it a little bit earlier in this build. The main problem that I see with this build for the vast majority of hunters is that you have to absolutely abuse your power spikes and everything has to be going your way in order for it to be more effective than other options. You have to utilize the high mobility, you have to use the shorter CDRs, and you have to make sure that whenever you get some stacks somewhere, you are aggressing with them. And that's just not how the vast majority of players plays. Yes, if you're playing at a very high level and you're really good at hunters, then you can capitalize on those power spikes better, but on most levels of play, that isn't happening. Resulting from that, my argument here would be that for the vast majority of situations where you want to deal high damage to enemy guards primarily, other options will be better, and even in the niche scenarios where this build is better, it is kind of hard to apply that for most players. And that makes it very difficult to utilize this to the same extent as a more simple build with Death Toll, Death Embrace, or even something like Hunter's Cowl. You can change things around a little bit, you can go for the Devourer's Gauntlet, which changes your power spikes a little bit and this and that, but overall I would prefer a more traditional route in the vast majority of situations, even though it's obviously fun to play around with Animosity. I would also say that in terms of build order, I wouldn't necessarily build Animosity before Kin size. It depends on the situation, how much defense they have and everything, but since you're already building a decent amount of pen, you actually should get some good damage with Kins through, whereas you can't build magical pen to make Animosity any stronger and it's still affected by mitigation. At the same time, again, Kins gives you extra power and attack speed as well. On the other hand, I will also say that I don't think MP5 is as much of an issue for hunters as Frost assumed, and I think that the Animosity build itself can also work on other hunters. We had plenty of builds that focus more on sustain and go for whatever, Leather Cowl and Devils or something like that at the start, and they don't really have MP5 and they still go through the early game okay, so I don't think it's something that only Hachiman can get built because of this. But yeah, after having tested all the stats and considering the conditions that you have to have for this build, where you skip your start and everything, it's probably not going to become my favorite. And as the structure push bonus is no longer there that used to be on the item, I don't think it's all that valuable in most situations. Now, if you want to see more breakdowns like this in the future, feel free to hit the sub button and maybe the bell so that you get notified of other upcoming videos. And if you want to see Frost's video about this build, then I will link that right here as well so you can check it out for yourself. With that, thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you for the next one soon. DPS, out.